I still remember that morning like it was yesterday. The sun was barely peeking over the rooftops, birds were chirping, and I was walking to my mailbox thinking about nothing more than my usual bills and junk mail. But that day, the universe decided to have a little fun. I opened the mailbox and froze. Inside was a crisp white envelope with bold letters that made my heart skip a beat. Notice of legal action, HOA dues past due. I blinked, then blinked again. And just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating, I read it one more time. The HOA was suing me for thousands of dollars, for fines, penalties, and what sounded like some kind of membership fee. Only one problem: I don't even live in that neighborhood. I've never owned a house there. I've never received their newsletters. Heck, I didn't even know anyone on that street. I held the envelope in my hands like it was radioactive. At first, I thought it must be a mistake. Maybe they sent it to the wrong address, but the letter was professional, typed on letterhead, and had a real signature from someone claiming to be their lawyer. Okay, I muttered to myself. Maybe they just want a donation, like a really aggressive donation. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to be easy. I sat down on the porch with the letter, trying to make sense of it. I could almost hear the HOA laughing in my imagination. "We'll teach them a lesson," they said. "Even if they don't live here." My mind was spinning. Could an HOA really sue someone who didn't belong to them? Could this possibly hold up in court? The more I thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. And yet the envelope in my hand was very real. I paced back and forth, muttering, "What do I even do with this?" I considered ignoring it, hoping it would go away. But the letter threatened late fees and legal costs piling up every day. Ignoring it could mean thousands more. So that was out. I considered paying just to make it stop, but something in me wouldn't let them win that easily. Why should I pay for a neighborhood I've never been a part of? After a few deep breaths, I decided the only way forward was to fight. I had no idea how messy it was going to get. I called a friend, explaining the situation, and even she laughed at first. "Are you sure it's real?" she asked. "Yes," I said, waving the letter, "and they want my life savings too." The thought of having to deal with a lawyer, court dates, and HOA bureaucracy made my stomach churn, but at the same time, I felt a spark of determination. I started thinking about what I would need to defend myself. Deeds, bills, anything that proves I don't live there. Photos, documents, even witnesses if necessary. I felt like a detective suddenly, uncovering evidence for a case I never wanted to be part of. And yet there was a strange thrill in it. The thrill of standing up to an organization that clearly thought they could intimidate me. By the end of that day, I realized something important. This wasn't just about money. It was about principle, about refusing to let someone strong-arm me just because they had a fancy letterhead and a self-important lawyer. I wasn't going to be their victim. And just as I was settling in to start gathering proof, another envelope slid into my mailbox. My heart sank. Another demand, another threat. The HOA was serious, and now it was personal. I looked at the envelope, took a deep breath, and whispered to myself, "All right, HOA, you want to fight? You got one." Little did I know that first letter was just the beginning. The real madness and the courtroom drama was still ahead. After the shock of that first envelope wore off, I knew I had to understand what I was up against. I sat at my kitchen table, a mug of lukewarm coffee in one hand and the threatening letter in the other, staring at the text like it was written in some ancient code. "How can an HOA sue someone who doesn't even belong?" I muttered. The more I thought about it, the more my brain refused to cooperate. Naturally, I turned to the internet, my trusted ally in moments of confusion and panic. I typed in, "HOA suing someone who doesn't live there." The search results ranged from "that can't happen" to "it happens more than you think." I read stories of people being harassed, fined, or even dragged to court over absurd HOA rules. And here I was, about to become the next headline. I decided to call the HOA directly. Maybe if I spoke to someone, explained the mistake, it would all go away. I was wrong. Very wrong. The first person I reached sounded cheerful enough, almost suspiciously so, like they were about to sell me a timeshare. "Yes, we've noticed you haven't paid your dues," they said. "You're still responsible." I choked on my coffee. "I don't even live there," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Silence on the other end. Then, "Well, past residents are still responsible for certain obligations," they added vaguely. I laughed nervously. "Past residents? I've never even driven down that street." I hung up, my pulse racing. This was not going to be simple. I dove back into research. HOA bylaws, membership agreements, legal forums, and even YouTube videos about people fighting absurd HOA claims. Hours passed in a blur of reading, note-taking, and muttering to myself. Somewhere between requirements to pay dues and legal loopholes. I realized that the more I learned, the crazier this whole thing seemed. At one point, I even made a checklist. 1. Prove I don't live there. 2. Gather documents. 3. Contact a lawyer. 4. Don't panic. May be impossible. I ticked off number 4 almost immediately because, let's face it, panic was inevitable. The emails started coming in too. Aggressive, polite-sounding, and utterly nonsensical. One email claimed that because I had interacted with the neighborhood in the past 5 years, I owed them fees. Interacted. The only time I'd ever been near that neighborhood was when I got lost on a weekend drive years ago. I stared at the screen, incredulous. Were they serious? Did they have nothing better to do than harass strangers? And then I found it, the smoking gun, or at least my lifeline. A public record showing that I had 0 ties to the HOA. 0, nada, not even a shred of evidence that could remotely connect me to them. My heart raced. This was going to be my weapon, my shield, my proof that I was not their debtor. But with every piece of good news came a new wave of panic. The letters kept arriving, each one more threatening than the last. Pay immediately or face legal consequences. Your property may be seized. You could be liable for court costs. I stared at each one, trying to stay calm, while imagining them storming my house to take my coffee maker as collateral. I even joked to myself, because if you don't laugh, you cry, that maybe I should just leave my mailbox empty for a week and see if they'd give up. Of course, I knew deep down they wouldn't. This was going to be a fight, and I wasn't about to lose to a group of people who clearly had too much free time and not enough common sense. By the end of the day, I felt a strange mixture of dread and determination. I was up against a bureaucracy that thrived on intimidation and confusion, but I also had something they didn't, the truth, and I was ready to arm myself with it. I closed my laptop, leaned back in my chair, and whispered to no one in particular, "Okay, HOA, let's see what you've got. You picked the wrong person to mess with." Little did I know the real chaos, the face-to-face confrontations, the courtroom theatrics, and the absurd arguments, was just around the corner. And when it hit, I would have to be sharper, braver, and maybe even a little funnier than I thought possible. The next morning, I woke up with a pit in my stomach. After hours of research, emails, and frantic note-taking, I realized it was time for the inevitable. I had to confront the HOA. Not literally in person, at least not yet, but by phone. And let me tell you, calling them was like trying to reason with a brick wall that had taken a law class. I dialed the HOA office, my fingers trembling slightly. The line clicked and a cheerful voice greeted me. "Good morning, how can we help you today?" I cleared my throat and tried to sound calm. "Hi, I received a notice from your association. I don't live in your neighborhood. I think there's been a mistake." A pause, then, "Well, according to our records, you are still responsible for dues and fees." I blinked, my brain stalled. I'm sorry, I don't understand. I've never signed anything. I don't live there, never have." The response was almost comedic. Sometimes past residents are liable for obligations if they've interacted with the property in any way. I laughed, half in disbelief, half in frustration. "Interacted with the property? I drove past once years ago. I barely know where it is." The line went quiet for a few seconds before they recovered. "Well, you can consult your attorney, but the fees still apply." I hung up, muttering to myself, "Fees still apply? For nothing? Really?" It felt like a bad sitcom, except instead of laugh tracks, I had a growing pile of legal threats in my mailbox. I realized quickly that ignoring this was not an option. They weren't going to stop until someone made them. Determined, I decided to respond with facts. I drafted a detailed email, attaching my property deeds, utility bills, and even a map showing where I actually lived. I typed out every detail, every explanation, every ounce of logic I could muster. Then I hit send and waited. Hours passed with no response. I began to relax, imagining that maybe, just maybe, the HOA would see reason. But late that afternoon, another email arrived. My stomach dropped. It was from their lawyer this time, and the tone was far more aggressive. "Your claims are invalid. You are liable for all fees and legal costs. Court action will commence if you fail to comply." I sank into my chair. It was official. They weren't joking. They weren't bluffing. They were serious, and they clearly thought I was going to cave in. I stared at the email, a mix of anger and disbelief bubbling up. How could people be this ridiculous and self-assured at the same time? Then, in a burst of determination, I did something I hadn't done yet. I called my own lawyer. I explained the situation, sending over every letter, email, and demand notice. My lawyer laughed, well, a nervous laugh, and said, "You have one of the clearest cases I've ever seen. They have zero evidence linking you to their HOA, but brace yourself. They're going to make this as dramatic as possible." I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that I had professional help, dread that the first confrontation had only just begun. I could almost imagine the HOA lawyers sharpening their pencils, preparing arguments that would make zero sense but sound intimidating. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the calls, the emails, the absurd explanations. "Interacted with the property?" I whispered to myself, shaking my head. "Who writes this stuff? Who actually thinks this is reasonable?" The suspense was killing me. I knew the court date was coming, and I knew that when it did, the real confrontation would be face-to-face. And in my head, I started rehearsing how I would respond, how I would stand my ground, and yes, how I would keep my sense of humor intact, no matter how ridiculous things got. By the time I finally drifted off, I realized one thing. This fight wasn't just about money. It was about showing that no one, no overzealous HOA, no sneaky lawyer, no absurd bureaucracy, was going to intimidate me into paying for something I didn't owe. And I had a feeling that once the court date arrived, the stakes were going to be higher than I ever imagined. After that first confrontation, I realized there was no turning back. The HOA wasn't going to give up, and their threats were only getting louder. I had to prepare, and not just a little. I had to prepare like my life depended on it, even if all it really depended on was my sanity and my wallet. I started by gathering every scrap of evidence I could find that proved I had no connection to their neighborhood. Deeds, property tax records, utility bills, even photographs of my home from the last 10 years. At one point, I dug through old emails just in case there was something, anything, that could accidentally tie me to them. Spoiler alert, there was. As I piled documents on my kitchen table, it started to look more like the command center of a detective movie than a homeowner's living space. I had folders labeled "Proof I'm Not Yours," "Evidence of Life Elsewhere," and even HOA absurdities. My cat stared at me suspiciously, probably judging my sanity. Honestly, I couldn't blame her. I was knee-deep in papers and legal jargon, muttering things like, "You can't sue someone for not living somewhere," to no one in particular. Next came the strategy. I had to figure out how to present my evidence clearly, persuasively, and maybe even with a little bit of humor. My lawyer helped me organize everything into a timeline. The day I moved into my current house, the days I visited the neighborhood, which, for the record, were almost non-existent, and a clear, detailed record showing I had never signed any HOA agreements. I even practiced my speech in front of the mirror. "Your Honor," I rehearsed, "I have never been a member of this HOA, I have never lived in this neighborhood, and I have no obligation to pay anything." I tried saying it with confidence, but sometimes it came out sounding like a line from a bad courtroom drama. Still, it helped me feel more prepared. Then came the research part that almost broke me, reading about other people's court experiences with HOA lawsuits. Some stories were terrifying, full of long, drawn-out battles and impossible demands. Others were downright ridiculous, like HOAs trying to claim fees for things as absurd as community spirit participation or unauthorized lawn decor. I laughed nervously, imagining the same thing happening to me. Could they actually try that? If they did, I would be ready. Of course, preparing for court wasn't just about documents and strategy. It was about mental preparation. I had to steel myself for the absurd arguments I knew the HOA would bring. I imagined their lawyers, perfectly polished and confident, presenting claims so ridiculous that even a stand-up comedian would struggle to keep a straight face. I reminded myself, stay calm, stay factual, and don't let them intimidate me. I also realized I needed allies. My friends became my sounding board, and I bombarded them with questions, documents, and my increasingly dramatic reenactments of HOA emails. "Look at this one," I said, waving a printed letter. "They actually claim I'm liable for services I didn't receive. We laughed until tears ran down our faces, but underneath the humor, the anxiety never left. And as the court date drew closer, I began to feel the tension in my chest tighten. Every time the mailbox opened, I expected another threatening letter. Every time my phone rang, I imagined it was the HOA demanding immediate payment. I knew that on the day of the hearing, I'd have to be sharp, composed, and ready to defend myself against not just legal arguments, but also absurdity itself. By the end of this intense preparation, I felt like a soldier ready for battle. I had my evidence, my strategy, my mental armor, and a tiny, but crucial sense of humor. I knew the fight was coming, and I was determined not to back down. As I looked at the stack of documents one last time, I whispered to myself, "This isn't just about money. This is about proving that logic and truth can stand up to nonsense." And little did I know, the courtroom confrontation would test every ounce of patience, courage, and humor I had left. The day of the hearing arrived faster than I expected. I woke up early, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling and wondering if this was actually real. I had spent weeks gathering documents, rehearsing what I would say, and mentally preparing myself for a confrontation with an HOA that clearly thought I owed them my life savings. Now, I was about to face them in a courtroom. I walked into the room and froze for a moment. The space smelled faintly of polished wood and nervous energy. The judge sat at the bench, a calm, imposing figure reviewing papers. On the other side, the HOA's lawyers were already seated, each one wearing the kind of self-satisfied smirk that made me want to roll my eyes so hard I'd probably hurt myself. They looked like they belonged in a courtroom drama, not a battle over imaginary HOA dues. I took a deep breath and approached the podium, clutching my meticulously organized folder. My palms were sweaty, my stomach a knot of nerves, but I knew I had the truth on my side. The judge glanced at me briefly, raising an eyebrow as if to silently ask, "Let's see what you've got." The HOA lawyers went first, of course. They presented their case with the kind of confidence that only comes from believing you're untouchable. "Your Honor," one began, "the defendant has failed to pay mandatory HOA fees and as such is liable for all associated fines and legal costs." I blinked. Mandatory fees. For someone who doesn't live there, I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Their arguments got more absurd by the minute. The defendant has benefited from neighborhood services without contribution. I raised an eyebrow so high I thought it might get stuck there. Services. I had never even set foot in the neighborhood, except for that one time I got lost trying to find a friend's house. I almost muttered, "I think you mean imaginary services," but wisely held my tongue. Then came the paperwork. They shuffled thick binders, highlighted sections, and read out names and addresses, trying to connect me to some kind of invisible membership. I glanced at my folder, which contained everything I had painstakingly gathered over the last few weeks: deeds, utility bills, maps, photos. My confidence began to rise. I had the facts. They had nothing. When it was my turn to speak, I felt a surge of adrenaline. I laid out my case clearly, calmly, and with just enough subtle humor to keep the tension bearable. "Your Honor," I began, "I have never lived in this neighborhood, I have never signed any agreements with this HOA, and I have no financial obligation to them. The evidence I present here today clearly proves this." I handed over copies of my documents. The judge flipped through them carefully, occasionally raising an eyebrow at the HOA's increasingly desperate objections. The room was silent, except for the faint shuffle of papers and the HOA lawyers whispering nervously to one another. I felt a small sense of triumph. I could see doubt creeping into their confident faces, and I couldn't help but smile inwardly. Then came the part that made my heart skip a beat. The judge asked a simple, direct question to the HOA lawyers. "Can you provide any evidence that this defendant is actually a member of your association?" The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Their smug expressions faltered, and for the first time I saw real panic. It was almost cinematic. The HOA lawyers shuffled papers frantically, searching for anything, to defend their ridiculous claim. But there was nothing. No signature, no membership, no proof of obligation. I felt like I was watching a slow-motion scene where logic finally caught up with nonsense. As the judge looked up from the papers, I felt the tension in my chest begin to ease slightly. I knew the truth was on my side, and now it was only a matter of time before it became official. Still, I stayed focused, ready for whatever absurdity they might throw at me next. When the judge finally spoke, I barely dared to breathe. But the words would change everything and set the stage for the next chapter of this unbelievable HOA saga. The courtroom was tense, the kind of tension that makes your ears ring and your stomach feel like it's doing somersaults. I could see the HOA lawyers glancing at each other nervously, their confident smirks now replaced with something closer to panic. And me? I was holding my folder like it was a shield, praying I wouldn't trip on the way to the podium. The judge leaned forward, tapping a pen on the desk, and asked what would become the pivotal question of the entire case. Can you provide any evidence that this person is a member of your association? The words hung in the air like a guillotine. Silence filled the courtroom. You could practically see the beads of sweat forming on the lawyers' foreheads. I swear one of them actually whispered, We don't have that," under his breath. My jaw dropped slightly. Did I just hear that right? The people suing me for thousands of dollars had zero proof I owed them a single penny. Then came the subtle chaos. The lawyers scrambled, flipping through their binders, muttering legal jargon that sounded like gibberish to me. "Well, the records, they might be somewhere," one stammered. I wanted to laugh so badly that I had to bite my lip. The sheer absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. They were making mountains out of molehills that didn't even exist. I stood there quietly, letting them fumble while the judge observed with an amused yet skeptical look. Finally, the judge leaned back, fixing the HOA lawyers with a glare that could melt steel. "So let me get this straight," the judge said slowly. "You are suing someone for non-payment, yet you have no evidence that this person is a member of your association." The room went utterly silent. Even my heart seemed to pause for a moment. One of the HOA lawyers tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. You could see the panic in their eyes, the kind of panic that only comes when reality slaps you harder than any lawyerly argument ever could. I felt a surge of relief, but also adrenaline. This was my moment. I spoke up calmly, making sure every word counted. "Your Honor, I have provided proof that I do not live in the neighborhood, that I have never signed any HOA agreements, and that I have no financial obligation to this association. It seems the evidence, if any existed, was never produced." The judge nodded, flipping through my documents again, and I could almost see the wheels turning. The HOA lawyers started whispering frantically to each other, clearly hoping the judge would ignore the glaringly obvious facts. But the truth was undeniable. I wasn't a member. I didn't owe them anything. Their case was built entirely on assumptions, threats, and sheer audacity. Then the twist happened. The judge leaned forward and addressed the HOA directly. "It appears that this entire case is based on unfounded claims. You have failed to provide a single piece of evidence connecting this defendant to your association. In fact, your own correspondence acknowledges the lack of proof." I almost choked on my own breath. Could this really be happening? The judge paused for dramatic effect, then delivered the words I had been waiting for. "Given the evidence, or lack thereof, this case is dismissed in its entirety. The HOA is ordered to cover the defendant's legal costs." The courtroom erupted, not in cheers but in stunned murmurs. I sat there in disbelief, clutching my folder like it was a trophy. The HOA lawyers were pale, muttering under their breath, clearly trying to process how their elaborate, threatening scheme had crumbled in seconds. I leaned back in my chair, trying to steady my racing heart. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave, but I couldn't help smirking at the absurdity of it all. They had really thought they could intimidate someone with no connection to their community, and now they were being humiliated in front of a judge. As the courtroom slowly emptied, I realized the gravity of the moment. I had stood my ground, faced ridiculous threats, and won. The twist wasn't just that the judge ruled in my favor. It was that the truth, combined with preparation and persistence, had exposed the entire HOA scheme for the farce it truly was. I walked out of the courtroom feeling a strange mix of triumph and disbelief. Victory tasted sweeter than I had imagined, and for the first time in weeks, I could breathe without tension clawing at my chest. But deep down, I knew there was still a lesson to be learned, and maybe a few more surprises waiting beyond the courtroom doors. I still remember the exact moment the judge's words hit me like a lightning bolt. Case dismissed in its entirety. HOA to cover the defendant's legal costs. My heart leaped. My jaw went slack. And for a brief, glorious second, I almost laughed out loud, right there in the courtroom, at the absurdity of it all. They had really thought they could sue someone who didn't even belong to their neighborhood. And now, in one decisive ruling, they were humiliated. The courtroom atmosphere was surreal. On one side, I sat stunned, clutching my folder like it was a championship trophy. Across from me, the HOA lawyers were a mess. Their faces were pale, mouths moving, but no words came out. You could see the panic in their eyes, the realization that their elaborate, threatening scheme had just imploded in front of a judge. One of them even tried to whisper something, but the words stumbled out incoherently. I leaned back in my chair, trying to calm the adrenaline rushing through me. My lawyer gave me a knowing smile and a thumbs up, as if to say, "Told you this would happen." I felt like I was floating somewhere between disbelief and triumph. The judge had not only dismissed the case, but also ordered the HOA to pay my legal costs. In other words, they were paying me for their absurdity. I couldn't have scripted a better ending if I tried. As I gathered my documents to leave, I glanced back at the HOA board members. They were still sitting there, stunned, whispering amongst themselves. I imagined the conversation. "How did we lose to someone who wasn't even part of our association?" I smirked. I could almost hear them blaming each other, scrambling for excuses, and probably questioning every life choice that had led to this moment. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt a sense of vindication that I hadn't expected. People passing by gave polite nods, probably wondering why I was smiling like I'd just won the lottery. In a way, I had. I had won more than a court case. I had won back my peace of mind, my dignity, and the satisfaction of seeing a ridiculous scheme collapse under the weight of truth. Later, when I shared the story with friends, we laughed until our sides hurt. "They actually tried to sue you?" one friend asked, shaking her head in disbelief. "Yes," I said, still laughing, "and now they're paying me for the trouble." The absurdity of it all was overwhelming. I had imagined the worst, prepared for the worst, and yet the universe had handed me a victory wrapped in irony and justice. Even as I celebrated, I knew the story wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about standing up for yourself, no matter how ridiculous the opposition might be. The HOA had assumed I would cave, that I would be intimidated by threats, fines, and legal jargon. But I didn't. I stood my ground, gathered my evidence, and refused to let nonsense dictate my life. The HOA's reaction after the court was almost comical. Rumor had it that their board meetings became chaos, with members arguing over how a stranger could beat them. Emails circulated, full of blame and panic. I imagined them sitting in their office, frantically trying to rewrite their bylaws to prevent anyone else from exposing their absurd tactics. And honestly, I couldn't stop laughing at the mental image. That night, I finally sat down at my own kitchen table, away from the stress, the threats, and the endless paperwork. I poured myself a glass of wine and raised it to the empty room. "To justice," I whispered, "and to never letting anyone intimidate me for no reason at all." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, replaced by a warm, victorious glow. Even in the aftermath, I knew this story would stick with me forever. Not just as a funny, ridiculous anecdote about an HOA gone wild, but as a reminder. Sometimes the most absurd battles can be won with patience, preparation, and a healthy dose of stubbornness. And in this case, it had paid off in spades. As I finally went to bed that night, I smiled, imagining the HOA members still muttering and plotting, while I slept soundly, victorious and free from their nonsense. The courtroom victory felt surreal. I walked out of the building with a mixture of relief, disbelief, and the tiniest hint of giddy triumph. It was one thing to imagine beating the HOA in court, but it was entirely another to actually see their smug, self-important arguments crumble before my eyes. The absurdity of it all still made me laugh silently as I shook my head. I couldn't believe I had just survived and won this bizarre ordeal. Back at home, I unpacked my folder one last time, laying out the documents that had saved me. Deeds, utility bills, photographs, maps, and every shred of proof showing I had zero ties to the HOA. I ran my fingers over the pages, feeling an odd sense of accomplishment. Who knew that a random envelope in the mailbox could trigger a full-scale investigation, a courtroom battle, and ultimately an unexpected victory? I called a few friends to share the news, bracing myself for incredulity, and as expected, they were stunned. "You actually won?" one friend asked, her voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "Yes," I said, trying not to laugh too loudly. "And they're paying me for the legal fees. Can you believe it?" We all laughed, the kind of laughter that comes from surviving something ridiculous and knowing the world's absurdities sometimes lean in your favor. But the victory wasn't just about money. It was about principle. It was about refusing to be intimidated by bureaucracy, threats, or the kind of overconfidence that comes from thinking an organization can bully a stranger. That HOA thought I'd fold under pressure, pay fees I didn't owe, and quietly disappear from their lives. Instead, I had done the exact opposite. I had stood firm, gathered the evidence, and confronted absurdity with facts, preparation, and a little humor. Even days later, the story kept replaying in my mind. I imagined the HOA board members back at their office, frantically discussing how they had lost to someone with no connection to their neighborhood. Their carefully drafted letters, their intimidating threats, their smug lawyers, nothing had worked. They were left with nothing but embarrassment, and the irony was delicious. I couldn't help but chuckle every time I pictured their flustered expressions. The whole ordeal also gave me a strange sense of empowerment. I realized that sometimes life throws completely irrational, unfair situations at you. And while they can be stressful, overwhelming, and even absurd, you can face them head-on. You don't have to let intimidation win. You don't have to let fear dictate your actions. Preparation, courage, and clarity can turn even the most ridiculous challenges into victories. I also learned to appreciate the little things. Walking past my mailbox without fearing another threatening letter. Drinking my morning coffee without obsessively checking for legal notices. Sleeping at night without worrying about an HOA that had no right to touch my life. The freedom that came with standing up for myself felt profound, more than any amount of money could provide. Of course, I told myself I would never look at an HOA the same way again. Every time I drive past one of their neighborhoods, I imagine the board members sitting in their meeting rooms, nervously glancing at their envelopes, wondering who they might accidentally sue next. And I can't help but smile, knowing that if they ever try to pull a stunt like that again, I and the law would be ready. By the end of it all, I realized something important. Life will sometimes throw ridiculous, almost laughable challenges at you. The key isn't to panic, to fold, or to let absurdity intimidate you. The key is to stay calm, gather your facts, and face the situation head-on, with courage, wit, and maybe just a little sense of humor. As I finally sat back in my chair, sipping a well-deserved glass of wine, I thought about the entire journey, from that first terrifying envelope to the courtroom victory. It had been stressful, exhausting, and at times completely surreal, but I had come out on top. I had proven that logic, preparation, and persistence could win over intimidation, absurdity, and greed. And maybe most importantly, I had learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply standing your ground and letting the truth speak for itself. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.